I speak 5 languages, sir. Her voice cut through the ballroom like a blade. The crowd froze, eyes shifting from the trembling maid to the billionaire who had just mocked her. Ethan Montgomery's smile turned razor sharp. "Oh, really?" he said into the microphone. "Then I'll kneel before you right here if that's true." Laughter, cameras, champagne still dripping from her hands. But she didn't move, didn't blink. "Then listen carefully," she whispered. And what happened next? No one in that room, not even him, was ready to hear. Before we begin this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city you are watching, and don't forget to leave your like to keep following us. The ballroom of the Grand Astoria shimmered like a dream carved in glass and gold. Crystal chandeliers hung above hundreds of guests, dressed in velvet and arrogance, their laughter echoing beneath the tall domed ceiling. A full orchestra played somewhere behind a curtain, its strings barely masking the hum of expensive conversations. Cameras from every major network lined the back wall. Tonight, New York's elite had gathered for the Global Bridges Gala, a charity event meant to promote education and communication across cultures. At the center of it all stood Ethan Montgomery, billionaire CEO of Montgomery Systems, tall, charming, and painfully aware of both. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his words rehearsed, his smile sculpted for the spotlight. He raised a glass, speaking into the microphone with his usual theatrical confidence. "Communication," he said, pausing for effect, "is what separates leaders from followers. It's what makes us global citizens. You see, I speak 3 languages, French, Russian, and Arabic, and that, my friends, opens doors that money alone cannot buy." Polite applause followed, mixed with admiring laughter. The cameras caught his grin, the confident gleam of a man who believed the world itself existed, to echo his brilliance. At that precise moment, Nora Bennett, one of the cleaning staff, walked quietly through the far end of the hall, carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes. She moved carefully, head slightly bowed, invisible among the glitter. Her uniform was crisp but plain, her dark hair tied in a neat bun beneath a white cap. She didn't look at the guests, she simply moved, the way people do when they've learned the cost of being noticed. Then, as Ethan raised his glass higher, her heel caught on the corner of the red carpet. The tray tilted. A sharp crash split the air. Crystal shattered across marble, golden liquid spreading like spilled sunlight. The orchestra stopped mid-note. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, their laughter waiting for permission. Ethan's jaw tightened, pride pricked by the interruption. Then came the smirk, the kind that told everyone he was about to turn the moment into a spectacle. He stepped toward her slowly, microphone still in hand. "Well," he said, his voice carrying easily, "perhaps this is the universe's way of telling us communication isn't always elegant." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Nora bent down, trembling slightly, gathering shards with her bare hands. Ethan wasn't finished. Switching effortlessly into French, he said, "Regardez-la. Elle ne comprend même pas la langue de la soirée." The crowd laughed again, not because it was funny, but because they didn't dare not to. He turned next to Russian, his voice rich with mockery. "Она, вероятно, не понимает ни слова, правда?" And finally in Arabic, "حتى في 3 لغات ما زالت لا تعرف مكانها." Nora froze, the shards glittering in her hands. Her breathing steadied. Slowly she rose, her eyes meeting his for the first time, calm, unflinching, almost sad. The room fell still. Ethan waited for her to apologize, to retreat, to play her part in his performance. Instead, she said softly, yet clearly enough for every microphone to catch, "I speak 5 languages, Mr. Montgomery." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Glass clicked faintly as a server hurried over with a dustpan, but Nora didn't move to let go of the shards. Her fingers were nicked, a thin line of red tracing the lifeline of her palm. She lifted her chin steady, the orchestra's silence swallowing every breath in the room. Ethan's brows lifted, amusement curdling into disbelief, then into the kind of smile men wear when they think a lesson needs teaching. "Is that so?" he said, letting the microphone find the corners of the ballroom. 5 languages? His gaze swept the audience, inviting them in on the joke. Ladies and gentlemen, New York never disappoints. A wave of polite laughter. The cameras tightened their focus. "Very well," Ethan continued. "Prove it. And I'll make you a promise right now in front of every witness here. If you speak 5 languages, I'll kneel before you." A few gasps followed. A woman near the front whispered, "He wouldn't," and a man replied, "He can't possibly lose." In the back, a producer signaled to a cameraman to push in. The gala had turned into a stage, and the audience wanted a show. Nora placed the tray carefully on a linen-covered table. She wiped her fingertips on her apron, the gesture neat and deliberate. Her eyes moved across the chandeliers, the pale columns, the marble floor that reflected all their glittering pride. Then she spoke, her voice low but carrying. "La dignité n'est pas un costume. Elle ne s'emprunte pas pour une soirée." The air shifted. A few guests who understood French fell silent. Ethan smiled tightly, bowing his head as if indulging a street performer. "2 more then," he said. Nora's tone changed, soft but rich with resonance. "اللغة beat, ونحن ضيوف في, من يهينها يضيع طريقه." A subtle murmur spread, not laughter this time, but something else. Respect, awe. Even the orchestra leader set down his baton. Ethan tried to laugh it off. "Lovely sounds," he said, switching back to English, "but let's not confuse recital with fluency." His hand gestured to her uniform, his voice dripping with self-assured superiority. "We're at a gala, not a spelling bee for the help." A few guests looked away. Others watched, frozen between discomfort and fascination. Nora didn't flinch. She took one calm step forward, her eyes steady on his. "Мы слушаем, чтобы понимать, а не чтобы побеждать." Her Russian fell like quiet thunder. Someone near the back whispered, "That was perfect." Ethan's laughter died somewhere between his chest and throat. The cameras caught his blink, the small betrayal of doubt. The air in the ballroom felt heavier now, as if everyone could sense that the performance had just shifted, and it was no longer his. Nora's lips parted again, her voice ready to climb toward the next language. The next wound, she would turn into grace. For a long heartbeat, no one breathed. The chandeliers hummed faintly above, as if the electricity itself were listening. Somewhere near the back, a phone's camera light flickered on, catching Ethan's profile. The billionaire showman framed in gold, his confidence cracking at the edges. He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had built a life on control, of people, of words, of every room he entered. Yet here was this woman, in a pressed uniform and worn shoes, commanding the silence he'd always claimed as his. Every glance that used to belong to him was now fixed on her. Even the orchestra, half hidden behind velvet curtains, seemed to wait for her next syllable. Nora's pulse drummed steadily in her ears. The glass on the floor glimmered like ice around her shoes. She could feel 1,000 eyes, but strangely, no fear. Years of silence had taught her that fear is just the moment before truth decides to speak. Ethan shifted his weight, tapping the microphone once, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Well," he said, his tone clipped, "that was impressive. If you're auditioning for the United Nations." A few forced laughs followed, but they sounded thin. The charm that once ruled the room had turned brittle. Nora didn't answer. She raised her chin slightly, as if measuring the air between them. Then, in a clear and deliberate voice, she began again, her 4th language, her tone edged with calm steel. "Riben yu de Huasutoki, ren hahunde wen kanakereba narimasen." The syllables rolled softly, melodic and strange to most ears, but they carried weight, dignity wrapped in grace. A murmur swept through the crowd, small but growing. A Japanese diplomat near the front straightened in his seat, eyes widening. "She's fluent," he whispered to no one in particular. "Perfectly fluent." Ethan's smirk faltered. "I don't suppose you have a translation for the rest of us?" he asked, his voice colder now. Nora's eyes didn't leave his. "So you said you could speak 3 languages," she said, her tone gentle, almost kind. "Perhaps you can translate." A ripple of quiet laughter spread, not cruel, but stunned. The balance of the room had shifted. It was subtle, but irreversible. People who once laughed at Ethan's jokes now avoided his eyes. A bead of sweat slid from his temple. "Cute," he muttered, though his voice betrayed a tremor. "4. Let's see you finish your performance." She hesitated, not for drama, but because the fifth language carried the heaviest memory. Her eyes softened, her breath came slower. When she finally spoke, it was almost a prayer. Deutsch ist die Sprache, in der mein Vater mich lehrte, die Welt zu verstehen. Her German was deep and resonant, the vowels grounded, almost mournful. A hush fell again. No phones, no clinking glasses, no whisper of silk. Just her words hanging in the air, untranslatable and eternal. Ethan's face had gone pale. The confidence, the laughter, the effortless superiority, all of it dissolved into the stillness she created. He looked down at her, then at the crowd, realizing that for the first time in his life, the applause he expected was not for him. Nora stepped closer, her voice low but carrying. You spoke 3 languages to humiliate me, Mr. Montgomery. I spoke 5 to remind you what words are for. The microphone in his hand trembled slightly. Cameras zoomed in on his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Around him the air shimmered with a kind of reverent silence, the kind that precedes judgment. Ethan blinked, his throat tightening. You, he swallowed. You rehearsed this. Nora's reply was almost a whisper, yet it carried through the marble hall. No, sir, life rehearsed it for me. She turned away, the echo of her steps trailing across the polished floor, leaving behind the weight of her words, and a man whose empire suddenly felt very small. For a long second, the ballroom stood frozen in disbelief. The chandelier light seemed to sharpen, bouncing off the marble floor and the broken glass at Nora's feet. Ethan's hand still gripped the microphone, but the power that once radiated from him had drained away. The guests, socialites, investors, politicians, sat in uneasy stillness, trying to decide whether they'd just witnessed humiliation or history. A single camera light blinked red at the back of the room, then another, and another. The moment was being captured from every angle. The billionaire who mocked the maid, and the maid who spoke the language of the world. Ethan tried to regain his footing with the same charm that had sold empires. Well, he said, forcing a laugh that echoed too loudly, what an unexpected twist for the evening. 5 languages, that's quite a claim. He moved closer, lowering his voice so only the nearest tables could hear. Let's hope you didn't pick them up on YouTube. The attempt at humor landed flat, not a single laugh. He cleared his throat and turned back to the crowd, smile tight, eyes flashing with irritation. Since everyone's so fascinated, perhaps our gifted cleaning lady would care to demonstrate. Whispers rustled through the ballroom like wind through silk. A woman in emerald leaned toward her husband. She won't do it, she murmured. She'll walk away. But Nora didn't move. She didn't even blink. The fear that had once wrapped itself around her spine was gone, replaced by something older. Dignity. The kind that didn't need an audience to exist. She took one step forward, the sound of her shoe clicking against marble echoing like a heartbeat through the silence. I don't need to prove anything to you, she said quietly. Ethan smirked, leaning closer to the microphone. Then I suppose we'll all assume it was just talk, and that's fine. Words without meaning are what you do best, Nora interrupted. The crowd gasped softly, the kind of collective inhale that changes the air in a room. Ethan's face darkened. He turned toward the audience again, trying to laugh, but the laughter never came. Nora's gaze swept the hall, past the gilded railings, the crystal, the false smiles, and landed back on him. You said you speak 3 languages, Mr. Montgomery, she said, her voice even. Tell me, how many of them do you use to say thank you? The words hit him harder than any insult could have. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Somewhere near the stage, the orchestra conductor stood, his bow still in his hand, eyes locked on her. Slowly, as if compelled by something unseen, he lifted the violin to his shoulder and drew the bow across the strings. A single note, low, trembling, beautiful, filled the silence. Nora turned to him and nodded once, a gesture of gratitude. Then she looked back at Ethan. You wanted me to perform, she said. Then listen. The violin lingered softly beneath her voice as she spoke again in French. La parole est un miroir. Celui qui s'y regarde sans âme n'y verra qu'un fantôme. The sound of her accent rolled through the air like velvet over fire. Even those who didn't understand the words felt them. It wasn't just speech, it was music, defiance, memory. Ethan took a half step back. His fingers twitched around the microphone, and for the first time that night he looked small against the vastness of his own stage. The violin note faded. The audience held its breath, unsure whether to applaud or pray. Nora's eyes softened. She wasn't gloating. She was mourning something invisible, the arrogance that had turned humanity into theater. Ethan tried again, voice trembling now. "You've made your point." "No," she said, turning from him slowly. "I've only started." She walked past him, her reflection cutting across the glass floor like a ghost in motion. Behind her, Ethan stood alone, surrounded by the glittering world he'd built to hide the emptiness of his silence. The whispering grew louder now, not the careful murmur of polite society, but the restless buzz of a room losing control of its own decorum. The billionaires, politicians, and actors who once admired Ethan Montgomery were shifting in their seats, their smiles trembling under the weight of discomfort. The orchestra had gone completely silent again, the last vibration of the violin still trembling faintly in the air. At the edge of the ballroom, a man from the press whispered into his phone. "She's speaking again," he said breathlessly. "Yes, the maid. Record everything." A red light blinked above his camera, and suddenly 3 more phones rose discreetly among the crowd. The story was already alive, crawling through social media faster than anyone could control. Ethan's smile returned, but now it was made of glass. He gestured toward Nora, feigning patience. "You've certainly captured everyone's attention," he said, "but I think we've had enough performance art for one evening, don't you?" Nora turned to him, hands clasped before her apron, the picture of composure. "You started the performance, Mr. Montgomery. I'm just giving it meaning." Laughter rippled from somewhere near the back, nervous but real. Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked around the ballroom, searching for allies, for anyone who would rescue him from this stage that had turned against him, but no one met his eyes. The empire of fear he'd built in that room was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, quiet respect for her. He tried again, his voice cold now. "You may think you've impressed them, but I built this evening, this company, this empire. You think a few foreign words can change that?" Nora's gaze didn't waver. "Words build empires," she said softly, "but they can also bury them." The sentence hung there, clean and merciless. Some of the guests gasped. Others looked down into their glasses, unwilling to watch a king lose his crown. Ethan turned his back to her and spoke into the microphone, desperate to take control again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've indulged enough nonsense. Please, let's continue the evening." He stopped. Behind him, Nora's voice rose again, low, calm, but carrying like a spell through the marble and glass. «Русские говорят, что истина, как солнце. Ее можно скрыть ненадолго, но она все равно ослепит». The Russian rolled from her tongue with elegance and certainty. A small group of diplomats in the corner straightened in their seats. One of them whispered, "She said the truth is like the sun. It blinds you when you try to hide it." The crowd stirred again. The translation moved from mouth to mouth, growing in intensity like a wave. Ethan froze, shoulders tightening beneath his tuxedo. She took a breath, then continued in Arabic, her tone gentle but unyielding. "Al-karamatu la tubar, wa la tushtara. Hiya tuladu ma'al qalb, wa tamutu bis-samt." Even those who didn't understand the words felt their gravity. There was something in the rhythm of her voice that stripped the glamour from the room, leaving only humanity, raw and exposed. Ethan's hand dropped from the microphone. His reflection in the mirrored wall looked older now, the smirk gone, the facade crumbling. He turned slowly toward her. "Oh, you've made your point," he said again, voice breaking slightly. "Now stop, please." Nora stepped closer, close enough for him to see the tiny cut on her palm from the broken glass. "You promised you'd kneel, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You gave your word in front of everyone here." The crowd went still again. The weight of the moment pressed against the chandeliers, heavy and electric. Ethan's throat worked, but no sound came. His hand trembled at his side. For the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. Nora's final words came quietly, almost tender. "Keep your promise." A camera flashed. Another followed. The room held its breath, waiting to see if the man who worshipped power could still recognize dignity when it stood before him. For a single, endless second, Ethan stood still. The air itself seemed to hold him in place, wrapped in the echo of her words. Cameras flickered in every direction. Flashes broke the silence like lightning across a storm. Every lens caught the same image, a billionaire who had mocked a maid now trembling before her. He could hear his heartbeat, slow, heavy, defiant. But even it began to sound like applause from another world, one that no longer belonged to him. Sweat glistened at his temple. The microphone in his hand had gone cold. "Mr. Montgomery," Nora said again softly, "keep your promise." There was no anger in her voice, no triumph, only truth. That made it unbearable. Ethan swallowed. The words wouldn't come. The sound of his own breathing filled the speakers, raw and human, stripped of power. Around him, people waited, motionless, unblinking, afraid to miss the moment when pride would fall to its knees. His mind clawed for a way out. A joke, a dismissal, anything. But the sentence he'd spoken earlier, "If you speak 5 languages, I'll kneel before you," hung in the air like a verdict carved into stone. He glanced toward the crowd. The same people who once laughed at his arrogance now stared with something closer to pity. No one smiled. Even his closest associates, the men who had built their wealth orbiting his ego, lowered their eyes. Slowly, painfully, he took one step forward. The lights above caught the tremor in his hands. His knees locked for a second, as if his body itself resisted humility. Then, with a faint exhale, he lowered himself to the floor. A gasp swept through the ballroom. Dozens of phones rose instantly. The image flashed. Ethan Montgomery, the untouchable billionaire, kneeling before the woman he had tried to humiliate. Nora didn't move. Her face didn't harden. It softened. The pity in her eyes was almost unbearable. She didn't want revenge. She wanted him to understand. He stayed there, one knee pressed to marble, head bowed, as the sound of camera shutters filled the silence. The orchestra conductor, unsure what else to do, lifted his bow again. A single note from the violin rose, trembling and mournful. Ethan's lips parted. His voice came low, cracked, almost unrecognizable. "I'm sorry." Nora blinked slowly, her expression unreadable. "Not to me," she said. "To them." She gestured toward the crowd. "To every person you made feel small." Her words rippled through the room, heavy and honest. Ethan looked up, meeting the sea of faces that once adored him, now mirrors of silent judgment. He swallowed again, forcing himself to speak. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "All of this, all of me. I used words to build walls instead of bridges." The apology was clumsy, awkward, but it was real. The crowd didn't cheer, they just listened. For once, the sound of sincerity was enough. Nora stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Humility is another language, Mr. Montgomery. I hope you learn it too." He bowed his head lower, a man stripped of armor. The music swelled softly, not triumphant, but redemptive. The violin wept as light from the chandeliers spilled over them like dawn breaking through arrogance. When Nora turned to leave, the crowd parted for her. No one stopped her. No one dared. As she passed, a woman in pearls whispered, "Who is she?" But no one had an answer. Ethan remained kneeling long after she was gone, long after the applause finally began. Hesitant at first, then swelling like rain against glass. For the first time in his life, Ethan Montgomery listened, truly listened, and understood nothing could ever sound the same again. The next morning, the city of New York woke up to a storm made of pixels and headlines. Every major news outlet, every gossip site, every trending hashtag carried the same image: Ethan Montgomery kneeling before a cleaning lady. The still frame was everywhere. The billionaire's tuxedo creased on cold marble, and beside him, the woman whose name no one yet knew, standing like a quiet flame in a sea of gold. Some called it humiliation. Others called it justice. The rest simply called it karma in high definition. By noon, Montgomery Systems' PR department was in freefall. Statements were written, deleted, rewritten. His board demanded explanations. Investors whispered about stepping down. Ethan sat alone in his glass office overlooking Manhattan, the city stretching beneath him like a map of all the places he once owned and now couldn't recognize. On the massive screen across from his desk, news anchors replayed the clip. His own voice echoed through the speakers, confident, mocking, cruel. "If you speak 5 languages, I'll kneel before you." And then the silence that followed, the crowd's breath the moment he fell to his knees. He turned the monitor off, but the echo stayed. He could still see her, calm, dignified, unshaken. Her voice in those languages replayed like a haunting symphony he couldn't stop hearing. «Regardez-la. Она, вероятно, не понимает ни слова, правда? حتى في 3 لغات ما زالت لا تعرف مكانها». Each phrase came back like ghosts, his own arrogance reflected through her fluency. Ethan leaned forward, pressing his hands against the cool glass of the window. Below, New York moved, indifferent, busy, alive. Somewhere down there she was probably walking home, invisible again. And for the first time in his life, the idea of being unseen didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like peace. A soft knock on the office door broke the silence. His assistant, Rachel, peeked in, hesitant. "Sir," she said quietly, "there's someone downstairs." She asked not to give her name, but he straightened, his pulse rising. "It's her." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "She didn't want to see you. She's just returning this." She held out a folded piece of paper. Ethan took it carefully. It was an envelope, plain and white, smudged slightly from fingerprints. Inside was a single note written in graceful handwriting. "Languages connect people, Mr. Montgomery, but silence teaches them who they are. N. Bennett." He read it twice. The words felt heavier than the paper that carried them. Rachel lingered by the door. "She asked me to tell you something else," she said softly. "She said she's not angry, just done." Ethan's throat tightened. He nodded, dismissing her gently, and sat back down. The envelope trembled slightly in his hand. Outside, the afternoon sun poured through the glass walls, harsh and unforgiving. He stared at his reflection, the billionaire, the genius, the man who had everything, and wondered when the world had stopped believing him. Later that night, when the city lights began to shimmer again, Ethan walked into the ballroom of the Grand Astoria alone. The room had been cleaned, polished, reset for another event. There was no trace of the spilled champagne, no sign of the moment that had destroyed him. Except one. Near the corner where Nora had stood, a small fragment of crystal still glimmered between the tiles. He crouched down and picked it up carefully, turning it between his fingers. It caught the light, bending it into tiny rainbows. For a long time he stood there in silence, the world outside moving on. And in that silence, for the first time, Ethan Montgomery began to understand what communication really meant. The city was already forgetting, as cities always do. New scandals, new stories, new distractions replaced the old. But somewhere beyond the noise, Nora Bennett had found the quiet she'd been searching for. She lived in a small apartment above a laundromat in Queens, a single window facing an alley where the light only reached for a few hours each morning. The radio on her table played softly in French, an old habit she'd never shaken. Beside it sat a small photo, a man and a little boy standing near a train station, both smiling, both gone. Every morning before sunrise, she made tea, opened her notebook, and practiced the same ritual she had followed for years. 5 pages of words in 5 languages. Not for anyone. Not to prove anything. Just to remember. She had once been Professor Nora Bennett, head of the linguistics department at Columbia University, specializing in comparative semantics and intercultural communication. She had lectured in Paris, Geneva, Moscow, Dubai, and Berlin. She'd written essays about how language doesn't just describe reality, it builds it. And then the world collapsed. Her husband David, an investigative journalist, had been stationed in Beirut when a bombing destroyed the press compound. Their son, Adam, 6 years old, had been with him that week. Nora's voice had died the day she got the call. She'd left her position at the university 2 months later. The words that once gave her purpose had turned into echoes that haunted her sleep. Years passed. Bills grew. Savings shrank. The life of the brilliant linguist dissolved until all that was left was a woman with debts, grief, and an accent that didn't belong anywhere anymore. The cleaning job at the Grand Astoria was supposed to be temporary, something to quiet the noise in her head. The uniform gave her anonymity, and anonymity gave her peace. She'd chosen silence deliberately, until Ethan Montgomery forced her to speak. That night at the gala, she hadn't planned to fight him, but when he mocked her in the languages she loved, the languages that connected her to every part of her lost life, something inside her refused to stay quiet. The words had risen like breath after drowning. Now as she sipped her tea, the radio cut to a news broadcast. Ethan Montgomery's voice came through, recorded earlier that day. "I don't want forgiveness," he said, "but I do want to understand what she tried to teach me. My company will be launching a new foundation, the Language of Respect, to provide scholarships for multilingual education, especially for immigrants and refugees. It's the least I can do." Nora froze, her cup halfway to her lips. The words felt unreal. The arrogant man she'd faced in that ballroom now sounded human, hesitant, changed. The announcer continued, "Mr. Montgomery has declined all interviews, but sources say he's been in contact with several educational organizations. The video of the gala has reached nearly 50 million views." 50 million? Nora set her cup down and leaned back, her eyes closing. Somewhere deep inside, where anger had once lived, something gentler began to take its place. She didn't want fame or recognition. She wanted her languages, the bridges her husband used to call them, to mean something again. She stood, walking to her window. The morning light had just started to creep between the buildings, illuminating the small notebook on her table. She flipped to a new page and began to write, first in English, then in Arabic, then French, then Russian, and finally in German. Each sentence carried the same idea, reshaped through sound and syntax. The heart understands before the mind translates. When she finished, she smiled for the first time in years, a quiet, private smile that belonged only to her. And in that moment, far above the city that had watched her humiliation, Nora Bennett began to speak again, not for applause, not for proof, but for peace. For days, Ethan tried to find her. He sent messages through the hotel management, through the cleaning staff agency, through anyone who might have known her. Every response was the same, polite, distant, final. She no longer works here. But the image of her standing in the middle of that ballroom, calm, fearless, illuminated by every light, refused to leave him. He'd spent his life building things, towers, companies, speeches. But this time, he wanted to build something invisible, something that could reach her. On the 5th day after the gala, he found himself walking through Queens, dressed not in the armor of a suit, but in jeans and a grey sweater. It felt strange to walk unnoticed, humbling. He stopped at a small cafe whose window displayed a handwritten sign in Arabic, Kalimat Tayyiba, kind word. The smell of cardamom and fresh bread drifted into the street. Inside, an older woman looked up from behind the counter. Her accent was thick, but her smile warm. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, surprising him. "You've come for her." He froze. "You know Nora?" "She comes here sometimes," the woman said, wiping her hands on her apron. "She helps me translate letters from my family in Syria." "She said you might come." Ethan's breath caught. "She said that?" The woman nodded. "She left something for you." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a small envelope. His name was written on it in perfect calligraphy, each letter shaped with care, not anger. He opened it slowly. Inside, a single note. "There is no need to find me, Mr. Montgomery." The lesson was already learned. But if you truly understand, build something that speaks when others cannot. Teach those who listen, not those who applaud. Nora Bennett. He read it twice, then a third time, the meaning deepening with every syllable. The woman behind the counter watched him with quiet understanding. "She is kind," the woman said softly, "but she carries sorrow like a song." Ethan folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his jacket pocket. "So do I," he whispered. He left the cafe and walked without direction, his hands in his pockets, his thoughts heavy but strangely clear. The city around him looked different now, not as a kingdom but as a chorus of languages, signs in Spanish, laughter in Mandarin, prayers in Arabic. It was as if Nora had taught him to hear the world for the first time. By evening, he stood before the old stone building that once housed an abandoned library. Dust covered its steps, ivy crawling across its pillars. A faded plaque still read, Public Languages Resource Center, closed since 2015. He stepped closer, running a hand along the cracked marble. Then, almost unconsciously, he whispered, "Language is a house, and we are only guests inside it." The phrase felt different now. Not elegant, not rehearsed, but earned. The next morning, Ethan announced the reopening of the center under a new name, the Language of Respect Foundation. It would offer free language education for refugees, immigrants, and underprivileged children. He would fund it himself, quietly, without cameras this time. And at the top of the first grant proposal, he wrote a single dedication, "For the woman who taught me to listen." That night, as the city lights shimmered across the East River, he opened his laptop and found the video again. The moment when she spoke, when the world fell silent, when he kneeled. He watched it without shame this time. When she said, "I speak 5 languages, Mr. Montgomery," he didn't hear defiance anymore. He heard truth. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Merci, Nora, spasibo, shukran. Danke, thank you." The words echoed through the empty room, a quiet symphony of forgiveness. And somewhere in a small apartment above a laundromat, Nora looked up from her notebook, as if she'd heard him. Spring arrived softly that year, as if the city itself had decided to start over. The first event hosted by the Language of Respect Foundation was small. No photographers, no red carpet, no tuxedos. Just a crowd of children from different backgrounds sitting in a bright room filled with light and maps. On every wall hung a quote in a different language, each hand-painted by volunteers. In the center of the largest wall, written in 5 graceful scripts, were Nora's words, "The heart understands before the mind translates." Ethan stood near the back, watching the teachers greet the children as they arrived. The sound of laughter mixed with snippets of different tongues, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, French, English, colliding like instruments tuning before a song. It was imperfect, chaotic, and beautiful. He had spent months working on this, quietly, carefully, refusing interviews, refusing praise. His fortune was still immense, but it no longer felt like power. It felt like responsibility. For the first time, he was learning what wealth could mean when it spoke softly. As the ceremony began, a volunteer approached him. "Mr. Montgomery, there's someone here to see you." Ethan turned, his breath caught. Nora Bennett stood in the doorway, wearing a simple grey coat and a calm expression that silenced the room without a word. Every face turned toward her, curious and reverent, though she seemed entirely unaware of the attention. He walked toward her slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The memory of the ballroom, the lights, the laughter, the shattered glass, hung between them like a ghost. "You came," he said quietly. "I wanted to see if you meant it," she replied. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes were kind. "I meant it," he said. "I couldn't forget what you said that night, or how you said it." Nora looked around the room. The children bent over books, the teachers switching between languages, the murals alive with color. "It's good," she said softly. "You did what I asked." Ethan smiled faintly. "No, you asked me to teach those who listen, but I'm still learning." Something in her face softened. "Then, you're on the right path." They stood side by side for a moment, watching a young girl stumble through her first English sentence, her teacher encouraging her gently. The child grinned as she finished, proud of her imperfect words. The sound of applause, small, genuine, rippled through the room. Ethan exhaled. "You know," he said, "I used to think power was about who spoke the loudest." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her. "Now I think it's about who listens the longest." Nora smiled, that same private, knowing smile that had once silenced a ballroom. "That's the first sentence you've said that sounds like a man fluent in something worth speaking." For the first time in a long time, he laughed. Not the polished laugh of a CEO, but something human, warm. Our teacher called the children together for a final activity. Each would write one word from their native language on a large white board to share with the others. The board began to fill. Amor, paz, esperanza, merci, Dobro, Slam. Ethan turned to Nora. Would you write one? She hesitated, then stepped forward. She picked up a marker and, with elegant strokes, wrote one word in Arabic. Karama. Dignity. The room went quiet again, the kind of silence that hums with understanding. Ethan whispered, "It suits you." Nora placed the cap back on the marker and turned to him. "It suits everyone, Mr. Montgomery. Some of us just forget how to wear it." Outside, the sunlight streamed through the windows, scattering across the walls like liquid gold. Children laughed, words mingled in every tongue. And in that moment, surrounded by languages, light, and the quiet redemption of two souls who had finally learned to understand, the world, for once, felt fluent. The ballroom was long gone. The cameras had stopped, but the echoes of that night never left them. Ethan Montgomery learned to speak again, not in French, Russian, or Arabic, but in the quiet language of humility. The man who once measured worth by applause now built bridges with silence and sincerity. And Nora Bennett, the woman who spoke 5 languages, found peace in the one that needed no translation: kindness. Years later, she visited the foundation he had built. She stood by the classroom door, watching children laugh in a dozen different tongues. On the wall above them, painted in her own handwriting, were the words she had once told herself in the darkest hours. The heart understands before the mind translates. She smiled. Somewhere behind her, Ethan stood, older, humbler, quiet. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither needed to speak. Because sometimes, forgiveness doesn't need a language. It just needs courage. The music swelled softly as sunlight filled the room, carrying their silence into something that sounded almost like peace. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heart-touching story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, watch the story I leave here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect.